Prime Minister, Boris Johnson is saying, hey, you're going to be reappointed, it's great, you're a great Chancellor. And he says, oh, by the way, there's one condition, you're going to fire all your advisors. As he's saying, he's feeling uncomfortable, because he's been told to do this, and he was taking his instructions from Mr. Cummings. These like some of our best people. You just want me to fire them? And then he said, Saj, they're only people.
Welcome back to Crisis What Crisis, the podcast that aims to guide you towards a more resilient life and whatever it might throw at you. If this is your first time with us, then please hit subscribe wherever you're watching or listening. It really does help make sure that these, I hope, useful conversations are shared as widely as possible. Joining me today is a politician who holds a claim to the title of former Secretary of State for Crisis. Sajid Javid made history as the first person of Asian background to hold one of the great offices of state when he became Home Secretary in 2018. In that and other jobs, including as Chancellor and Health Secretary, he ran towards a number of truly difficult, knotty political issues, including, of course, the Windrush scandal and the Grenfell tragedy. But the government's own leadership crises and dysfunction, frankly, too often brought his time in those roles to a premature end. How he reflects on those years of British political crisis is something certainly that we'll discuss today. But Sajid is also a man who has dealt with personal crisis, personal challenge. Raised in a two-bedroom flat above a shop in Bristol as children, Sajid, his four brothers and his parents, who arrived from Pakistan in the early 60s, faced repeated racism. But Sajid's innate resilience and academic gifts allowed him to break through and somehow find a route to Exeter University, where his interest in politics really began to develop. After a very successful 18-year career in banking, Sajid made the decision to become a politician. During his time as Home Secretary, he also faced the trauma, the tragedy of losing his eldest brother, Tariq, to suicide. A tragedy that he says left him with what he describes as survivor's guilt. Having announced that he will step down at the next election, Sajid continues to contribute to the debate on the public crises that we face, not least on the future of the NHS. Sajid Javid, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
How are you?
Happy. Yeah, I'm very happy to be here.
Great to have
Thank
you. We're talking as what is, of course, being described as yet another political crisis rumbles. The Tory party once again displaying its ability to remove pistol and blow off its own toes. Now that you're still an MP, of course, although you've announced that you'll be stepping down in the next election. Now that you have a bit of distance, certainly from the front bench, do you despair what you see at the moment? Or do you take a sort of slightly different view?
No, I do. I find the whole situation very depressing, really. And then, look, the party at the next election is going to be asking for a fifth consecutive term, and of course that's very difficult. I don't think it's ever been done in history. But we're not helping ourselves with all this infighting. And the one thing I certainly learnt during my sort of 13, 14 years in Parliament is that the public won't elect a disunited party, and no one gets everything they want, and people want to see a party that is sort of pragmatic and instead of striving for perfection in everything, is just doing what works, and we seem to have just lost that.
We talk a lot on this pod about the overuse in politics of the word crisis. James Landau came on recently and he had a nice phrase. He said it's sort of crisis inflation, from media as well, frankly, and of course from politicians. Although there were undeniably occasions during your time in some of those big jobs that you held where using the word crisis was entirely justified. What is your view of the word? I
think in politics generally it's probably overused. And if I sort of look back, certainly in the last few years, there's a few things that I think that most people would undisputably describe as a crisis. We've had, just in the last 3 or 4 years, we've had two what you might call once in a century events. The pandemic and the because of the war in Ukraine, the energy price crisis. I think those are two sort of proper global crises. In domestic politics, I think we do tend to sort of overuse it a bit. And sometimes that can be for someone's political advantage. They want to describe something as a crisis when it's not. The other thing I would say, though, is that what might not be a crisis for the country or even a part of the country, it can be a personal crisis for someone, or it could be a crisis sort of within their own department. One other thing, by the way, I think you learned during my time in politics, sometimes when there is a crisis, governments don't want to use that word, right? They just don't want it. And I remember when I was the housing secretary, when Theresa May was Prime Minister, and I felt there was a housing crisis, and I still do. That houses have just become unaffordable for anyone under the age of 40. And I think that's a housing crisis. And I think we've slowly been building up to that point under successive governments. And I wanted to, in Parliament, in my statements, talk about a housing crisis. And I remember having this debate with Theresa May and her team, and they said, you can't use the word crisis. You just cannot say that. I said, well, it is. And if we don't recognise that it is, then people won't believe us that we're actually really trying to address this. And she was against it, but I went and used it anyway. And then it actually helped in that she eventually then agreed I could do a housing white paper.
Yes.
I think if I had not used the word crisis, she probably wouldn't have agreed to that. So, you sort of sometimes, strangely, there are things, certainly in my political experience, that I think are crises, but governments just don't want to talk about it. Similarly, with the Windrush crisis, I think it was a crisis.
Yes.
And again, I remember when I became Home Secretary, when Amber Rudd had suddenly left, and I was asked to become Home Secretary, and that was the first thing in my entree, the most important thing there and then. And I remember again being told, don't call it the Windrush crisis. When you go to Parliament, I had to make a statement on that day.
This is officials saying that to you?
It was not. It was the Theresa May SPADs.
Right.
You think when you get into Parliament, you make your statement on this.
Yeah.
Do not call it a crisis. And I think they knew I had form, because just a year earlier I'd called the housing situation a crisis. So,
yeah.
And then probably not surprisingly to them, I went to Parliament and I called it the Windrush crisis. But I actually think it helped me deal with the situation, because it was so obviously a crisis that obviously not affecting everyone in the country, but I think whether you were affected by it or not, most people cared about the situation of others, the people that were caught up in the Windrush crisis. And I think by accepting that it's a crisis, I think people at that point truly believe the government gets it, and now they will do what they can because they know just how bad a situation this is.
Another word that we're fans of on this podcast is stoicism. Your family, although of course of Muslim faith, also seem, from how you've described them, as stoics. Your mum and dad were people who leaned into life's challenges, difficulties. Have I got that right?
Yes. Yeah. I always consider myself very fortunate in that there's a lot that I didn't have when I was growing up, but one thing I did have and I wasn't short of was a good family and the love of lucky to have two parents and my siblings and things, and so it was sort of a loving, sort of caring household, and in terms of the challenges that we faced as a family. That inevitably made a huge difference.
But their attitude towards it, I mean, the work ethic that was instilled in you was, it was incredible. Your dad, I think, was a relentless worker from the moment he arrived. Mr. Night and Day, as he was known by friends, a bus conductor who punched through, what was really a wall of racism to become a driver. And then the owner of a shop, your mum working round the clock in that shop that they opened together. So that work ethic sort of instilled, but also resilience, grit.
From my earliest memories of my parents until the moment they eventually sort of retired was they just worked every hour that there was. And so even when my dad, for example, when he was working on the buses, and when we lived in Rochdale, at the weekends, if he wasn't working, he would do market stalls first for other people. Then he'd have his own market stall selling ladies' clothing. That's eventually how he got into opening a shop, selling the same thing. My mum used to sew clothes to be sold in the market stalls, and I many memories of going to bed as a young child, and my mum would sort of come up, put me in bed, and then she'd go back down. I'd hear the humming of like the brother or the sewing machine,
yes.
while I'm going to sleep, and I'd wake up and I'd come down, there's a table full of trousers or blouses that she's sewn. There was nothing there when I went to bed, and then she'd be off to work, to either work in one of the shops or to work in someone else's shop, and so that's what I remember. And throughout my life, when we had shops, my parents would both work in the shops, 6 days a week at least. My dad's case, often 7 days a week, and that's how me and my brothers, that's how we were brought up. That hard work is really important, and that you should never shy away from it. And challenges will come along, and then you have to deal with it. And I saw plenty of challenges for my parents, and I learned from that.
And the challenges that you saw, were not just building a business, were not just taking care of a family. It was racism, and racism of a most kind of aggressive and difficult nature at times. I mean, the words sprayed on the walls of the shop, I think.
I mean, sadly, growing up, certainly in the 70s, early 80s, I faced plenty of racism. And first, my earliest memories are when I was very young, living in Rochdale. I remember quite often, I'd walk to school with my cousins and my brothers, and there'd be sort of what I would describe sort of National Front sort of skinheads en route, teenagers, a lot older than me at the time. And I'd have to avoid them, because the times that I didn't avoid them, I would get punched in the face, punched in the stomach, called packy, and all sorts of other things. And I was about 6 or 7 years old, 8 years old maybe at most. And then you learn to, at that age especially, I think you just learn to sort of avoid the racists, as it were. As I got older, I got angrier about it and things, because then I could sort of, I was in a position where I'd feel very sorry for my parents and what they were having to face. And to take an example, and you touched on it, I can remember a number of occasions, and this is when my parents had a shop. We lived above the shop, and we'd wake up in the morning, go down to the shop, and someone would have spread, packy bastard or something along the windows of the shop. And then my poor mother, my dad would be ranting and raving and be really upset. My mother would be the sort of practical one and actually get out detergent and other things, and she'd be scrubbing it. And sometimes I'd want to help, but I had to go to school. And I'd be really upset at school, like, why would someone do that to my parents' shop? And they were, they're working hard to earn a living, and people would do that. I remember instances, I'd help out in my parents' shop on a Saturday. And I remember people coming in, and sometimes, and they'd say, can I have a discount on X? My mother would say, I'm sorry, we can't offer a discount. And they'd call her all sorts of racist names and knock over a few things in the shop and walk out. And the kind of thing you don't forget. And we had to deal with that. Now, that said, I must say that 99% of customers in the shop were great people and very, really sort of decent, honest customers and things. But we did see probably too much racism. I think things have improved a lot in our country since then. It's by no means sort of perfect when it comes to race relations, but it doesn't feel like that era anymore.
How did you deal with it as a family? So after a day like the one you just described, going to school, having just while your mum is trying to wash that word off the front of her shop, how did you deal with that then as a family? How did your parents handle it? Very tight unit, you and your brothers in the flat, that evening at dinner. What's the conversation? How did they... Because it strikes me that your parents were clearly incredible people. How did they steer you away from anger, right? Because seeing that at that kind of age could have sent you on a completely different path.
We tried not to talk about it. And it would an incident like that would inevitably come up with one of the either me or one of my brothers would bring it up. I could see my parents would not really want to talk about it, and to the extent they did, they would just sort of almost not brush it off, but sort of say, look, that's life. We just need to carry on, right? We shouldn't change everything, and it shouldn't change anything, and we should, as a family, we just, we carry on. We have to ignore it, and to some extent, I guess as a child, I began to accept that. But I'll tell you another incident that always stuck in my mind, a very racist incident where I was 11. I started my new secondary school. In the first week, there was one of the guys in school, sort of self-declared sort of National Front supporter, skinhead. And I was just in the school playground. He came up behind me, punched me in the back of my head, kicked me in the back, and knocked me down on the floor. And started kicking me on the floor. And my school was almost all white. The only non-white children in the school other than me were my two brothers.
Right. And
the other school children just sort of crowded around and just said, fight, fight, fight. And I'm just getting kicked, and he's just shouting, Packy, repeatedly kicking me. And lucky someone told my eldest brother, Tariq, and he came and pulled him off, and and then took me to see the headmaster. Eventually, that the boy who did this, he got expelled from the school. But you don't forget something like that. I remember going home that evening, and then I didn't really want to tell my dad, but Tariq did. And my dad said, first thing he said, well, that's awful, you're right. I said, yeah. He goes, did you fight back? Did you hit him? And I said, no. And he said, well, next time hit him. Right, if he does that, you've got to defend yourself. Right, next time do it. And fortunately, there weren't too many next times of that nature, but there was one more where, a year later, someone challenged me to fight at school, saying they want to fight because, I'm not white and people like me shouldn't be in the school. And I said, okay, fine, let's have a fight. And we started a fight, and I punched him a couple of times, and he backed off and walked away. And I did learn a lesson from that. I'm not saying it was the best lesson, but sometimes you have to fight back and stand up for yourself.
But I mean, you describe it there, Tariq diving in to help you. Yeah. As brothers, you must have been incredibly tight.
Yeah, we were. Tariq was my eldest brother,
yeah.
And 4 brothers in total. I'm in the middle, and we all grew up, very, very close, and sharing all sorts of successes and failures and talking about everything. We were very close, and we were probably 5 of us. We were probably 5 of us born in sort of 7 years, so we weren't that many years apart as a group of 5.
Yeah. Your talents, Sajid, weren't spotted until quite late in your school years. And in fact, I think there was a bit of resistance, right? You weren't allowed to take your maths O-level, so you found a way of doing it yourself.
That's right.
You had to change school because they wouldn't let you take the 3 A-levels that you needed to get to university. You went to a different college. And once there, I think your talents were finally spotted. So, this is... Having painted the picture that you've painted, you then also got this sort of slightly softer, I guess probably less aggressive, but a resistance to progress for you. And yet in you somewhere is this kind of, no, I'm doing what I need to do. Do you remember when that sort of switch came on for you?
I think when I was very young, I could see my parents struggling and dealing with all these challenges we've spoken of. And I was determined that things would be different for me, and also different for my parents, that I would do something about it when I grew up. Apart from one short occasion, my parents never owned a home. They always lived on the rented flat above the shop. And for example, I think, when I'm older, I want to earn enough money and buy my parents their first home. And I'd think about things like that, and that would really motivate me. And then I just thought that whatever challenges come my way, I'm going to have to just crash through them and deal with them. And there was got to be a way, because other people are successful. So why can't I be? And I used to think like that from an early age. And so, the O-level story is that is quite right. I wanted to take O-level maths. I went to my local comprehensive. It wasn't a very good school, and they didn't really encourage children even to sort of do A-levels, let alone O-levels. And the general expectation was that you'd sort of leave school at 16 and go and find a job. I remember my careers teacher when I was 15, when there was an assessment of the things you like, don't like, and she said, Sajid, you can have a brilliant career being a television repairman with radio rentals. And I thought I wanted a bit more than that, and well, a lot more than that. And you're right, they didn't want me to do the O-level, so I went to tell my dad, and he said, look, how much does it cost to sit the O-level? I said, well, Dad, the problem is the paper costs £27. I remember the cost. I said, but and my dad said, oh, we can afford that. I said, no, but I need to be taught some lessons.
You need to
some
tutor.
things that, I need a tutor. And then my dad said, look, I can give you £50, and that's it. I remember going through the Bristol Evening Post, finding a tutor. There was a university student at Bristol, and he'd agreed to teach me for £10 a lesson, and ended up giving me a lot more lessons than I could afford. He did them for free. Same with A-levels. The school would only let me study 2 A-levels. I needed 3, so I switched schools, went to a local college. And I was the first in my family to go to university as well. And that felt alien, like looking for a university. I didn't know at the time, it's hard to believe, but at the time I started thinking about this thing called university, I didn't know anyone in my or my family's social circle that had ever been to university. So I couldn't
You had no frame of reference.
I could not talk to anyone. So what I ended up doing was, this is days sort of before internet and things, to do the research. I went to Bristol City's Central Library to get the sort of prospectuses on various universities. I had no idea. I'd heard of Oxbridge, but that was about it. And the librarian that I'd go and ask for these prospectuses from took pity on me and sort of realised I was interested in university. And she had turned out to have gone to, I think it was Bath University or something. And so she became my sort of help on choosing universities, and just by chance. And in the end, I ended up going to Exeter University, which was great, changed my life. But I remember arriving at Exeter and then noting that something like 90%, maybe more at that time, the students around me had all gone to private schools. And I felt a bit out of place. But it turned out to be one of the best decisions of my life.
Tell me about that. Tell me about walking into that environment for the first time. I mean, how much doubt were you carrying? Because from that story, it sounds like you're clear-sighted, you're driven, you're determined. Maybe there's a bit of kind of, I'll prove you wrong as well in there, I'm sure.
There was a lot of that. And on that, Andy, what it was is that by then I'd realised I'd already had a number of instances in my life where people, often well-meaning people, would say, when I set myself an ambition or a target, they say, well, you're not really going to be able to do that, are you? Because how many people do you know, or do we know, that have achieved that? And that's everything from doing, 3 A-levels, going to university, and then later in my life, wanting to work in the city, wanting to become a Conservative MP, thinking that one day I might be a minister, one day I might be in the cabinet. All along my life, there's been people, as I say, well-meaning, that said, you're not really going to be able to do that, are you? Because, again, how many people do you know, or do we know, that's ever achieved anything like that? And some, when it was in government, obviously, it was, in history, people hadn't achieved some of the things that someone from my background
Where did that
had.
come from then, I suppose, is the sort of question I'm asking. Because I can see where the resilience came from. I can absolutely see where the work ethic has come from. But where did the belief come from?
I had a deep, like a hunger I wanted to show my parents that it would be the fact that they left their country, came thousands of miles and settled in a new country that wasn't their own at the time, and all the sort of aggression that they took and things in first settling here, that I, as their son, that I would show them that it's been worth your while, right? And that I could not only sort of succeed in terms of a good job and earn some good money and things and like them, but also in the society that had become our new home now. And to me, one of those ways was, of course, being involved in politics, getting to Parliament, and showing them that look what we can achieve as a family, and this is in our new home, and how we can help others as well. And so, I had that hunger all from my sort of mid-teens onwards, and throughout university. So that when I was at university and I started applying for jobs, so for when I eventually graduated, I sort of fixated on the city and I didn't know much about it at all. All I knew was that, it's exciting, and if you do well, you can make good money for yourself. And I thought, well, why don't I try that? And again, a lot of people said to me, look, you don't wear the old school tie and all these. So at the time, you referred to as British merchant banks, that they're not really going to take someone like you.
You applied to a couple of British banks before
I did. I applied to British merchant banks, and I remember them. It was Rothschilds, as it was the sort of old Rothschild, so to speak, then, and Kleinwood Benson was another one. And I got interviews. They both rejected me. I remember the Rothschild interview, for example. It was held in Bristol, actually, and it was a hotel, and I walk in this room, and there's 6 men in pinstripes sitting there at a table. I'm standing up, they're all sitting down. And the first question, second or third question, they asked me, what does your father do? And then I said, he runs a shop, and he was a bus driver, runs a shop. And their faces, would tell 1,000 stories. And I thought, there's no way they could offer me a job, and I was right. Kleinwood Benson was much the same. I didn't get offered a job, but I did also apply to American banks that had just started expanding in the UK, Chase Manhattan, Merrill Lynch, and both of them offered me a job. And Andy, there's an important thing I learned here. The reason those American banks were expanding and growing and offering that competition to the tired old sort of British banks in the city was because of Margaret Thatcher. Because she had made a big set of changes in the city then that were known as the Big Bang, big deregulation, which encouraged competition. And that meant for these businesses that, it was costly to be racist, costly to just focus on your own, right? What really made money was getting the best talent in, regardless of their color or their background. The American banks, were much more meritocratic. They were much more competitive. They were much more hungry. And that would not have happened, and I would not have got that break in the city if Margaret Thatcher had not made those changes. And what it made me realize was how politicians can make a huge difference to your life and your life chances.
Before then, though, you were a very successful banker. What was your key skill? What was it that you were really good at as a banker?
I was very creative. And what I mean by that is in banking, as well as all the sort of traditional sort of products, regular lending and savings products and things, banking then globally was becoming more competitive. Borders were breaking down between countries in terms of transferring capital and products, and customers were becoming more sophisticated. So one thing I turned out to be good at, I think, was creating products, creating solutions to what you might call financial solutions, a bit like an engineer, right, but in banking, like a financial engineer.
Right.
So, a company or a client would have a problem, some financial issue, maybe with managing, risk. Could be interest rate risk, could be foreign exchange risk, or just something to do with lending. And I would be someone that could sort of go in, look at the big picture, then narrow down on the issues and come up with a solution.
Was there a bit of the kind of proving people wrong as well that was sort of powering you at that point in that environment?
Yeah.
Were you still out? You were still on the mission, so to speak?
I was. It reminds me of when I remember when I first started with Chase Manhattan Bank, so the big American bank that gave me the job offer. And in my first week, as a sort of 21-year-old fresh out of university, I remember bumping into the person that had interviewed me in my final interview, and obviously must have said something positive because there I am working for the bank. And I saw him, and I remember his name is Tim, and I said, Tim, it's me, Sajid. And he took a moment to remember. He goes, yeah, I met you at Exeter, right? I said, yeah. I said, I just want to know. I said, you hired 12 people that year in Europe, throughout Europe. I think 4 of them from the UK. And you had the pick of the cream of the crop. I was the only one that they hired that didn't go to Oxbridge, right? I said, why did you hire me? And he looks at me and he goes, oh, it's simple. He goes, you've got hunger in your belly and you don't wear green wellies. And then walked off. And I thought, well, okay.
If it is that simple.
Yeah, fair enough.
What about your relationship with risk then?
obviously no risk manager gets everything right, but you want to clearly be more right than wrong. And I felt that things were going very well, and I felt very comfortable with it until, while I was there in Asia, the global financial crisis comes along, and that was a big test for me. It was a proper crisis, and I learned a lot from it. But I look back now, and especially considering what happened to other bankers with risk books, even other banks, and I think in the end it turned out okay, but I wasn't to know that at the time.
Aside from the sort of technical elements of that, what about the personal elements? So what did you emerge with from that experience in terms of, the sort of Sajid Javid approach to crisis management? What were the sort of principles that you kind of brought with you out of an experience like that?
So a couple of things. I'd say first, it sounds obvious, but I think not enough people do it, is just stay calm in the crisis. When other people around you, and they were in my own team, they were sort of getting very nervous, they were being erratic, not getting enough sleep and things. Just stay calm and considered. And when you make decisions, you just, again, sounds obvious, just before you execute it, just think twice about it, think carefully, get a second opinion, and don't just rush into judgment. Get as much information as you can. Data is everything, as much possible information as you can, and think about sources of information that you might not have used before and things, and so you really are best informed as possible. And try to think also a step or even a couple of steps ahead. Obviously, it's very hard, but trying to think that, okay, if I make this decision now based on this information, how might others react, right? What's the behavioral response of others to what you might do? You're not operating in a vacuum of decision-making. Another thing I'd say is that I want to say never. I don't know if I can ever say never in this, but I was tempted to say I never took the crisis home with me. And so when I was in Singapore, for example, the financial crisis, I was, my whole family, we were all living there. And I might get home late at night or whatever, but I won't be discussing this at the kitchen table or with my wife at night and things. I just wouldn't get into it.
You'd literally say to yourself before you step through the front door.
Absolutely. Yeah,
right.
Always. And I did that throughout politics. I could be dealing with whatever. I could be in politics, it could be pandemic, it could be Salisbury poisoning, it could be Windrush, whatever. I would not go home and start talking about it.
Do you have an internal device that allows you to do that? I do, because some people talk about, literally stopping at the threshold of the door before they go in and getting themselves
I pretty much did that. I mean, obviously, I couldn't completely because, if I get a phone call or some message, I have to, of course, I'm going to deal with it.
Yeah.
But I try to do that. And even again, I know I'm jumping ahead a bit, but in all the time I was minister, which is most of my time in Parliament, obviously ministers have their red boxes, right, where you get tons of briefs and paperwork and submissions, and you take them. Normally, a minister will take those home, and then they'll get home, maybe have a bite to eat, and open up their red box at night or whatever. I would rarely do that, apart from the weekend. I wouldn't do that, because what I'd much rather do is I'd stay late in the office, finish my red box, and then go home. But I didn't want to open it at home.
Keep the separation.
So the moment I open that box at home, all the sort of challenges of the day are just going to come flooding back. It's going to fill my head, and it's going to be hard to switch off.
From the outside looking in, there's an easy narrative here, right? That you're driven, you're out to prove yourself and prove others wrong. You're doing brilliantly, in terms of your acceleration through the world of banking, and that you want to succeed sufficiently from an economic point of view to then be able to do what was really always on your mind, which is politics, and then who knows, maybe Prime Minister. That's the sort of easy narrative that sits behind your story when you look at it from a distance. Did you have a plan?
I did think that. I didn't think... I didn't have the confidence at that time that I would necessarily make it, as in get to be an MP, because I knew how competitive a process it was and all of that. But I did think that. and by that, what I mean is that I did think from sort of my university days on that, if I am successful in business and and I make some money and enough to look after my family, that at some point maybe I will try and become an MP. And but I could easily have also just carried on the banking. But I think by the time I was sort of getting to after 20 years or so in banking, getting to about to hit 40, I think, I thought that that banking just isn't doing it for me, and I became less interested in the money, a lot less interested, and politics and Parliament became more on my mind. And then what changed was, but I still wasn't ready to do anything about it, because I also thought I was leaving it very late, because it was 2009 by the time I was really thinking this. The next election was going to be 2010. But what happened was I think it was April that year, I got a call. I was in Singapore. I got a call from a friend of mine. I'll name him, as he won't mind. Tim Montgomery called me up, old university mate, and very involved in Conservative politics. And he said, "Saj, are you still interested in becoming an MP at some point?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "I do, but haven't I left it too late?" He goes, "No." He goes, "There's this expenses scandal, and it's going to be big, and there's going to be so many resignations right across the political spectrum, including in some good parliamentary seats. So if I were you, I'd get your name on the candidates list and keep your options open." And that's what I did. And because of Tim's call, that's exactly what I did. And then he was absolutely right. And then with 4 or 5 months later, I decide I'm really going to go for this properly. I have to take a big risk, which is quit my job.
Laura, your wife?
Yeah.
She was...
My wife has been the support in everything that I've done since I met her, which was when I was 18, and she was 100% behind me. Not because she wanted it. I think if I'd actually asked her for an honest opinion, she would much rather I didn't go into politics at all. But she knew that it meant so much to me, and I was absolutely driven by this.
And your parents?
At the time, my parents were very, very supportive. My dad, I think he fully understood what it meant to be in Parliament and stuff. He'd followed British politics he was very interested in current affairs things. I think for my mum, being someone from a Pakistani village that never had any formal education, but still one of the smartest people I know, to her, I remember saying I want to get into politics. Her idea of politics was politicians in Pakistan, and she just thought, well, why would you want to do that? Because it's not considered a particularly good career in Pakistan. And so she said, why would you want to do that? Aren't you better off staying in banking and things? So, but eventually she understood the importance of it. And so what happened then was in 2009, that summer I quit my job, which was a big decision. And then I spent months looking for a parliamentary seat, which obviously, for anyone that's done it, you never know whether it's going to be successful or not.
Yeah, but you do get in. You become an MP, and your rise is pretty meteoric. I think, though, you lost your dad, Abdul, in 2012. That was before you got your first cabinet job, am I right?
That is right. It's before I had my first job in government.
But he saw you on the...
He saw me get elected, and
he
he came to Parliament after I was elected, and I was very proud to show my parents around in Parliament, say, look, this is where I work.
Amazing moment.
And my dad, especially, because of his interest in politics and current affairs, and by then he was very proud to be British. I think he was very, very proud. It was nice to have that moment.
Tell me about the early days then in the party. You worked for George, didn't you?
So I arrived, and I've got to say, in the first few months, I started thinking maybe I've made a mistake, because I thought, I just can't see how you get on in this place, right? No one knows you. You don't know who you can trust. The whips, your own party whips, are only interested in you following instructions,
being useful.
And then I thought, I can't possibly see how you can get be a minister or anything. There's no sort of mechanism. There's no HR department or anything. So I remember after a few months going home night after night saying to my wife, oh, God, I think I might have made a mistake. I'm not sure if this is going to work out. And then I thought, look, I'm in this obviously at least for those 5 years I've been elected for. I wasn't going to leave early or anything. So I thought, you know what, let's make the most of it. And let's start talking about, and it sounds novel, I think more politicians should do it, which was I thought, let's start talking about publicly what you know about. And don't talk about what you don't know about. And that was not, as I said, not what most MPs do, in my opinion. Because you constantly get asked by whips, can you go and speak on this debate, that debate? And I would say, look, I don't know anything about that issue. I'm not going to go and talk about that. And they say, oh, don't worry, we'll tell you what to say. I wasn't interested in that. So I started talking about the global financial crisis, the Eurozone crisis and things like that I knew a lot about. And then there was one thing that then happened and changed my life, and I wasn't to know it, which was George Osborne did a budget. In his first year, did this budget. And most MPs in the forthcoming budget debate of 4 or 5 days would not want to speak until at least a day after the budget, so they can read all the newspapers and things and see what they said about it and then set out their own thoughts based on that. And so on the day he delivered his budget, the only people that stood up in the chamber to speak were, I remember it was Alistair Darling. It's very sad that he's no longer with us. I think he's a great man. I got to know him many years later. As the former Chancellor, he stood up. And then I think it was Andrew Tyree, who was chair of the Select Committee, the Treasury Select Committee. And then that was it. And there's and then they were about to close the debate. And George thought he could leave early because the tradition is that the Chancellor stays there whilst the debate is the early part of the debate. And I suddenly stand up and everyone's like, who the hell is this guy? And I go and give my verdict on the budget. And I wasn't to know it, but then George went back to his office. He told me later, he went back to his office and said, who was that guy that on our side that stood up and actually seemed like he knew what he was talking about? I need to see him. And then
who was that guy who knew what he was talking about?
Yeah, on our own side, right? And then eventually, he takes an interest and a few months later, I find out I've suddenly been asked to be his PPS, your Parliamentary Private Secretary. So that was a sort of important moment, I guess, in my parliamentary career, and I wasn't to know it at the time.
Number of cabinet roles come. We're racing through, so apologies for that. Culture Secretary first, then Business Secretary. There's also a moment when the stars align in such a way that you decide to stand on a joint ticket with Stephen Crabb for the leadership. That didn't work out for a range of reasons. In July 2016, you become Secretary of State for Communities. And during that period, of course, you led the response to the Grenfell Tower tragedy. Would you say that was the most difficult crisis from an emotional point of view, from the human perspective that you had to deal with?
Yes, I would. I mean, you've said it from. I would have added, if you hadn't said it, from a emotional and personal point of view. Yes, it was the most difficult. And as you said at the start, I dealt with what I think a lot of crises in government, but that was certainly emotionally the most difficult. And it was because these people, so many people, had just lost their lives in the most terrible circumstances. It was my job, rightly as the housing secretary, to respond to that. And when I went to see Grenfell Tower soon after the fire, when it was safe to go and do so, and then I met many of the survivors, I mean, I was just heartbroken, like what had happened to these families and how and the loved ones they'd lost. And then a few weeks later, I held a public meeting and invited all the sort of families and relatives. I remember my office saying, "Oh, look, we scheduled 2 hours, and you've got a really important meeting afterwards, and you must leave." I ended up, I think, 4 hours there, 4 or 5. I was just so, I'm going to stay here as long as people want me to. I'm going to listen to every single person, every story. And it was just one heartbreaking story after the other. And I just resolved to myself, I've got to do everything I possibly can to help these families and people across government, so whatever issues they've got with any other government department and things.
Because there was some differences of opinion, if I can put it that way, on how the government reaction should be organised. There was also a fair bit of criticism about a lack of empathy, a lack of kind of, a human understanding, particularly directed at Theresa May, frankly. I think very unfairly. What was your view of how the government was being viewed at that stage, if you like?
I think that, I certainly found that Theresa May was very supportive, and I couldn't say that about all other members of the government at the time in terms of understanding just how important this was and getting our response, making sure it's as strong as possible. But in all my dealings at the time with Theresa May, then Prime Minister, whenever I went to her and I said, look, I needed this, I need more sort of bodies to help with this aspect of it, I need more support on housing, I need more money for this, she was very, very supportive. I think she found it difficult to show that, sometimes emotionally to show that. I remember having a conversation with her where, she said she was going to go and visit some of the survivors and their families. And I remember actually saying to her, look, make sure when you do that you show your true emotions and stuff. And she said, why are you saying that? Why did you say that? And I said, because, and then I could see I'm getting into a difficult conversation with her. I said, well, because I'm not sure you always do. She goes, well, I do. And I thought, probably not worth having this conversation anymore. But I don't think she really maybe she did. But what I absolutely will say during that time, that in terms of the government response, she was very supportive of me in what I needed to do.
2018, you become Home Secretary. That true moment of history. First person of Asian background to hold one of the great offices of state. Did you sort of appreciate what you'd achieved at the time?
No, I don't think so. It happened all of a sudden. Obviously, there was no reshuffling things. Sadly, Amber Rudd had gone.
Yeah.
And in fact, what had happened was, I think, just that same weekend, I think she'd resigned on a Sunday. I was appointed on the Monday morning. On the Sunday, in one of the sort of Sundays, I think it was a Sunday Times, I don't remember, I'd given an interview. I was interviewed about housing and communities. But I was asked about the Windrush crisis, a situation which was just sort of starting at that point, I guess. And I answered it honestly, and I just said, look, I think this is terrible what's happening. And the government at that point was trying to sort of almost pretend that it's not a crisis and actually it's just a few odd cases here and there and we can handle it. That was the message going out for government. And I just thought, this is sounds to me so serious. And I said something like, that this could be my parents. This could be my parents who'd come from Pakistan, and if they didn't happen to have got their UK passports and stuff, they'd be undocumented and could be trying to throw my parents out of the country, who had every right to be here, right? And then I get a message on that Sunday from someone in Theresa May's office, number 10, saying the Prime Minister's really upset that you said that. You're rocking the boat. She doesn't like it, and she's really upset with you.
This is from one of her spads.
Yeah. So can you keep your mouth shut about this? Don't get involved. And then I thought, oh shit, she's a bit unhappy with me, and so so I didn't think much of it the rest of the day. 24 hours later, I'm Home Secretary. So I thought, wow, okay, she must have been really upset, right? And actually, I actually think, looking back, probably had I not said that, I'd be less chance of being Home Secretary. Right, because by then she's realised.
Opened their minds to.
Yeah, I think at that point, certainly some people in the team realised actually this person really cares, understands this issue. This is the biggest issue, and let's make him Home Secretary because he will be able to empathise and deal with it, and that's what we actually need to do.
But you didn't feel a sense of pride in the moment, or in the days after. I mean, in
the days after, I of course I was happy to be Home Secretary, great office of state, such an important job. In the first couple of days, I was so sort of consumed by what I had to do. It's such a important role in normal times, but especially at the time of that crisis. And I hadn't actually appreciated until later. Someone mentioned to me, said, when I became Culture Secretary, I was the first MP that was not white to become a cabinet minister, to become a Secretary of State. But this was the first as a great officer of state, and I hadn't really sort of appreciated that bit. But it didn't make any difference to me in terms of my job.
But the line from, if we just chart it from in the terms of this conversation that we've been having, if we chart the line from you walking past your mum, trying to wipe off racist abuse from her shop window when you're on your way to school, to you walking into the Home Office as the Home Secretary, is incredible. At any point, perhaps after the event, I don't know when, perhaps you'll tell me, as that, when that achievement, have you appreciated it?
I mean, I don't know if I have. And when you say it like that, I mean, if anyone had seen me living on Stapleton Road in Bristol above the family shop, some 30 or so years later as Home Secretary, I think, if someone said that, this kid on Stapleton Road could be Home Secretary one day, I think no one would have thought you'd need your head examining. I think I really haven't sat there and, thought, let me appreciate that, and whether it was as Home Secretary or Chancellor or Health Secretary in a pandemic. But you said at the start, I feel that throughout my political career that often for Prime Minister, when there was a crisis, a problem, it was, let's get Sajid in to deal with it. And in some ways, I think that's, a compliment in the sense that I think you can deal with a crisis and you can manage those situations. But what it didn't not allow me to do was to stay longer in a particular job and make sort of much longer lasting reforms, which is what I would have wanted to do in each of those departments.
Sajid, it was during your time as Home Secretary that you lost your brother, Tariq, who took his own life. You've been open about the pain, obviously, of his death, but also your survivor's guilt, as you put it. Explain that for me.
Well, it was, as you say, I was Home Secretary at the time. Obviously, I was busy. But you should never be so busy that, I feel that if people you love can't come to you and spend time with you to talk about what's on their mind. And I now know what I didn't know then was clearly something, my brother, Tariq, was having serious, mental health challenges and other challenges in his life. He didn't talk to me about it. He didn't talk to any of my brothers about it. He kept it all in. And then he killed himself. And I feel that had I known, I would have been able to do something about it. And had my brothers known, maybe we could have done something about it, but we didn't. And he didn't talk to me, and he used to talk to me a lot when I was, I think, less busy, if I put it that way. And maybe he thought I shouldn't disturb, Sajid because, he's really busy, he's trying to help run the country or whatever. And I feel that what I should have done is notice. Now since then, I've learnt a lot about suicide prevention. I've worked with some great charities and learnt a lot from them. I talked to a lot of people.
Samaritans, haven't you?
Yeah, Samaritans and others, and I've learnt about how one can try and spot some of the signs of someone who might be having suicidal thoughts, about how to talk to them, and particularly men. Right, they're harder to 70% of suicides are men, and it's harder to talk to, I think, on these issues. And had I known that and thought about that, I would have done something about it, but I didn't, and I'm not going to get another chance. And so it was a very, very difficult period for me. It was obviously my brother and how close I was and all the brothers were. And then after that, I thought I want to do more about this. And then many years later, when I later found myself as Health Secretary, and that's the department that has the sort of responsibility for the policy area, if we can call it that, I made it one of my priorities, and I wanted a suicide prevention plan, cross-government, 10 years, fully thought through, funded, and all that, and that's what's happened. But also, it's something that I continue to want to do more on.
Talking about what happened, and I think some perhaps discouraged you from talking about what happened, which is one of the issues around suicide. It was a very powerful decision that I have no doubt has helped many others. Has it helped you?
It has helped me in the sense that I think it's helped. Yeah, has it helped me to talk about it? Yes, it has. And but what I want to do is, from this is to help prevent suicide, and I think I'm in a position where I can do something about it, and I'll continue to do that. And I didn't, for example, I didn't know until after Tariq's death that suicide is the biggest killer of people under the age of 30 and the biggest killer of men under the age of 50 in this country. And now I've known that for a few years now, but every time I say it, it still shocks me.
Yeah.
Right? And I think most people don't know that. And also there are some things not that difficult that anyone can do to try and spot these signs. Because sadly, at some point in one's life, you quite like to come across someone who might have these kinds of thoughts. And so the more we all know about it, the more we can do.
So give me three things that for the audience listening to this now, in that context, what is it more in sort of practical terms?
The most important thing is to get people to talk, right? And as I say, it's harder with men, and is to get them to talk and get them to open up. And in doing so, it's perfectly okay to say to someone, use the word suicide, right? You say, actually, are you having suicidal thoughts? It's perfectly okay. And in fact, a lot of people would say it's almost like a good way to open the subject, because suddenly people will think, well, you know what I'm thinking, you know what I'm going through, and they're much more likely to open up. And another thing is that to say that there are certain risk factors for people who do sadly take their own lives. And it's knowing about what those risk factors are. They could have had another loss in their family. They could be having severe financial problems. It could be a severe health problem, and looking for those and thinking about your friends that might have suddenly gone quiet off the radar, so to speak, and might be having one of these other issues, and trying to put that together. But by the way, I would just say on the Samaritan's website, there's it's fantastic. It's full of information. If someone just spent 5 minutes looking at that, they'd learn a lot, and they can probably go on to save a life.
Very good. July 2019, Sajid, you become Chancellor. Another amazing moment for you. But in February 2020, you resign after refusing to dismiss your team of special advisors. A crisis of an altogether different kind. A sort of crisis around a point of principle.
Yeah.
Was that actually an easy decision for you?
In one sense, it was. It was a pretty black and white decision, and there was no other way I could have gone. So in that sense, it was. In that, there I was, Prime Minister, Boris Johnson is saying, hey, you're going to be reappointed, it's great, you're a great Chancellor, blah, blah. And then he says, oh, by the way, there's one condition, you've got to fire all your advisors.
That's literally how he puts it?
That's pretty much it. You've got to fire all your advisors. I had 6 special advisors, you've got to fire them all.
Just the two of you in the room?
No. It was the Cabinet Secretary, the head of sort of compliance and ethics,
Dominic Cummings,
Dominic Cummings wasn't in the room.
Whose idea it was for you to
but he wasn't in the room.
Entire team replaced.
Yeah,
was not in the room.
If he'd been in the room, it would have been far too obvious, because you could, then you could tell, just from his facial expression. So, and I could see that the Prime Minister then was, following instructions, because it was the only point in the discussion where he was looking at his notes and reading from his notes and not giving me eye contact.
Right.
So I knew, as you say, he's feeling uncomfortable, because he's been told to do this, and he was taking his instructions from Mr. Cummings. And then obviously I reacted immediately. I said, I can't do that. I'm not doing that. And I remember saying to him, I said, look, this is, do you realize these people that you're talking about, they're like long-term Conservative supporters. They've helped the party. They work for other ministers, prime ministers. My chief of staff had worked for David Cameron. Stuff like that. These are like some of our best people. You just want me to fire them? And then he said, Saj, they're only people. Don't worry about it. And I said, well, I said, I'm not doing it. And he said, why? Because don't you want the job? Don't you want to be Chancellor? I said, yeah, of course I do. I said, but I'm not going to do this. Then he asked me to take some time out, 10, 15 minutes, think about it. I think partly it was because then he could see I'm not going to do this. And
you step out of this is in the cabinet room, is it? So
I step out in one of the side rooms. Mm-hmm. He goes back into his study. I can't be sure, but I'm 99% sure to consult Mr. Cummings about what to do next. Mm-hmm. While I'm in this room, I get two of his most senior people come in, and they say, "This is all Cummings. Just do what he's saying because Cummings will be gone soon anyway. Just agree for it for now. Otherwise, you'll have to, he won't change his mind." Anyway, obviously, I couldn't because I just thought to myself in that room. I sat there and I thought, imagine me now going back to the Treasury, getting my team together, my spads, who have been with me through thick and thin. Some of them in the Home Office, dealing with the most difficult situations. Some even in the community, dealing with some of the biggest crises I had. Right, and I go in there and say, "I'm all right, Jack. You're all gone, but I'm all right, Jack." I couldn't do it. I just couldn't do it. And then I went back to the Prime Minister. I said, "I'm not doing it." He begged me to change my mind again and again. And I said, "You're going to have to decide. It's either me or Cummings." And he clearly was deciding on Cummings. And I said to him, "Fine." I said, that guy, as in Cummings, I said he's not going to be content until he burns the house down. He's running rings round.
That's the phrase you used.
Yeah, and he won't be content. And then I walked out.
Well, you weren't wrong, were you?
I was going to say unfortunately, but it was all entirely predictable. And then I went up. The next thing, I went out of the cabinet room to the lift, the internal lift, went up to my flat above number 10. My wife was in there. And she obviously didn't know anything. None of this was public at this point. It was all, right afterwards. And she says, "Oh, congratulations. I think I'm being reappointed." And I said, "No." I said, "I quit." And she looked at me, she goes, "You haven't." And I said, "I have." And she said, "What happened?" I said, "I'll tell you later, but I've quit." I said, "But what you need to do right now is get the dog, get a bag, and go to our house in London, because the press will be all outside the house in a minute, and leave right now." And she said, "Well, but I want to know." I said, "No, just get the dog and go. I've got to go to the office." And obviously she was very supportive, and then that was it. And then then Boris called me that evening to say how sorry he was and it's not what he wanted and all that kind of stuff. But I don't regret the decision one bit.
You must have been bloody furious.
I was furious because that job, being Chancellor, obviously was a great opportunity, especially after we just won an election with a decent majority, to make some real change. And the thing that I really, really wanted to get my teeth into was the sort of what Boris called levelling up. And obviously easily said, much harder done. And I just felt it was perfect for me in terms of the experience I had in government, outside government, my background and everything. And I'd worked on this a lot during the election campaign. For example, like 2 months before I left as Chancellor in December, I'd given Boris a 20-page personal minute, detail by detail, on every aspect of government policy about how you level up. And I'd really thought about this, and I thought, we've got 5 years, we've got a majority, and I'm really going to get my teeth into growth around the country, into skills, into infrastructure. I was so looking forward to it.
Well, that is the tragedy of Boris Johnson, is the missed opportunity. We can talk about the narcissism, we can talk about the dysfunction. I know, obviously, you've just given us a gold-plated example of it. We can talk about the kind of, the political failures, but the real, I think, what will stand the test of time as a summary is the massive missed opportunity.
It was massive. It's massive because we could with that majority, with the plans that I had, that he, every time I talked about it, he said he liked, and we could do, and I felt could be empowered to do this. And instead, he takes the route that he did, listening to the wrong people.
So how do we break this cycle of dysfunction then, Sajid? How do we sort of? I guess I'm going right back to the start of the conversation, right? Of where politics is right now. How do we start to, whether it's a Conservative Party or whether it's a Labour Party, who of course most people now think will form our next government, we'll see. But how do we break this kind of cycle of dysfunction and all those other characteristics that seem to have fallen in over the course of the last 5 or 6 years? Now that you're heading towards the exit door, what's your sort of analysis of how we begin to repair all this?
I think, first of all, overall, we need better quality politicians. We need more talented politicians that are in it for the right reasons. And I mean, I've said this before and I'll say it again. I think we got too many MPs, for example, and for what you want from them, the responsibilities that the country is giving them, they're not paid enough to get people of the right talent in. Now, when I say that, people say, "Oh my God, they're paid twice the national average. They shouldn't be in it for the money." And no one's saying that they're in it for the money. But if you want people that are at the top of their game, be it in business or in the public sector, they could be doctors, teachers, or whatever they are, right? And you want them to give up what they've got and come into politics, you've got to start by paying them something that's going to help them keep whatever lifestyle they got as a head teacher, but get into politics. I think that is important, and we're nowhere near doing that because no politician will touch that conversation. Yeah. Secondly, I think we politicians collectively need to be much more honest with people about some of the big challenges we face. And top of the list, I put the NHS, and that is in crisis. And
you've called for a royal commission.
It's obvious it's going to stay in crisis until politicians take their head out the sand and say, actually, there's a big problem here. The reality is the NHS is not the envy of anyone else in the world, right? No one else. There's no one else in the world, certainly in any industrialized country, that looks at the NHS and as soon as they understand it for 5 minutes, they think, I want that model. No one wants that model, and there's a reason for that. Because we spend at least the same amount, if not more, as most other sort of European countries, for example, and in that you can throw also in Canada, Japan, Australia, and those countries that all have universal healthcare systems, but by and large, they all have better outcomes. And so something isn't working. And no politician will stick their head up and say, actually, we need to look at this. And that's why I've called for a royal commission, because I think that's the best way to try and not quite neutralize it, but to try and say, look, let's have let's keep a sort of consensus around the principles, but let's look at what's working in other countries and learn from it and see if we can apply that here, and let's bring the great and the good together. So I definitely passionately think we should have a royal commission on it, and that requires not the heads of all the major parties, certainly the two big ones, to come together and agree to that, and we seem nowhere near that at this point, but it's something I'm going to keep fighting for. And there are other big issues. NHS is the top of the list, but others that I've mentioned, like housing. We have too many NIMBYs in Parliament, right? And we're going backwards on housing. And, we've got more than enough land in this country to build the homes the country needs, and we need to just be honest about that. And have that sort of grown-up debate. Now, the problem with all this, and you'll recognise this because you've seen it, is that it's easy to say all this, I would say, but how do you actually get the politics there? And that's why I was trying to use the things like the Royal Commission as the sort of mechanism for almost politicians that they know there's a problem. They don't really want to say it themselves, almost like they can hide behind it and say, look, the Royal Commission said this, so we better do it type thing. And in the past, we've faced these problems before, but unfortunately, I think that we now seem to be in a bit of a situation where unless something turns into a major, major crisis, we don't make the reforms that are necessary. We don't do enough of looking ahead to what could be a crisis and trying to address that now, right? Crisis prevention.
You've said you're standing down. Does that mean the door's closed forever for you on politics? You've made that decision?
I've made the decision that obviously I'm leaving Parliament and politics. what I will still want to do, because it's me, is that my interest in the country and its challenges, in social challenges in particular, is still strong, and I want to still do things when I've left Parliament. Certainly, spend a big chunk of my time doing things that are addressing your social challenges, social causes, and I feel that because I'm not in the government of the day or even in Parliament, that I can be maybe a bit more open about the challenges and that we face, trying to come up with sort of practical ways. Maybe I can do more work across parties and work with others from other political parties. And
but
try
if the
to
stars aligned,
solutions.
and anything can happen in politics these days. David Cameron's just come back as the Foreign Secretary.
I thought you were going to say that.
Anything can happen.
Yeah, I'm not.
You completely close the door on. So, because you're still in political terms, you got years ahead of you.
Yeah, I don't think I'll be back. I don't think I'll be doing a David Cameron. I don't see that, but I will still stay involved in my own way.
Great, Sajid, thank you for your time today. It's a fantastic conversation, and thanks for being so open and fulsome in the telling of your astonishing story, because it is an astonishing story. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much.
If you've enjoyed this conversation with Sajid, please do give us a rating and a review. It really does help. And if you hit subscribe wherever you download your podcasts from, you will find loads more useful crisis conversations. You can follow us on Instagram and TikTok, and you can watch the full episodes on YouTube. Just search for Crisis What Crisis podcast. You can also find full transcripts of this and every episode on our website, crisiswhatcrisis.com. Thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, you see, there's a